The Cold War was not just fought with missiles and spies in the shadows. It was also waged in the corridors of embassies, in the streets outside consulates, and in the catastrophic failures of intelligence officers who cracked under pressure or gave in to their worst impulses. For all its carefully crafted image of ideological discipline and operational superiority, the Soviet Union suffered diplomatic humiliations that exposed the fragility of its foreign networks, the recklessness of its personnel, and the brutal consequences of its own paranoia. These were not mere embarrassments. They were disasters that severed relationships, destroyed intelligence networks, and left blood on the floors of consulates and embassies. What follows are 5 of the worst diplomatic scandals in Soviet history, moments when the machinery of Soviet power broke down in the most public and damaging ways possible. The first of these disasters unfolded in the chaos of revolutionary China in December 1927, when the Soviet consulate in Canton became the site of a massacre that would poison relations between Moscow and the Kuomintang government for a decade. The Soviet Union was still young, barely a decade old, and its leaders believed that the wave of communist revolution that had swept through Russia would soon engulf the rest of the world. China, torn apart by warlords and political factions, seemed ripe for transformation. Moscow threw its support behind the Chinese communists, even as it maintained uneasy diplomatic ties with the Kuomintang government, led by Chiang Kai-shek. But Chiang had his own plans. In the spring of 1927, he turned on his communist allies, launching a brutal crackdown that would see thousands executed in the streets of Shanghai and other cities. The communists, desperate and cornered, attempted to strike back. In Canton, now known as Guangzhou, a communist military revolutionary committee staged an armed uprising in December, supported by Moscow, and briefly seizing control of the city. For a few days, it seemed as if the revolution might hold. It did not. On December 13th, as Chiang's government troops moved in to suppress the revolt, they turned their attention to the Soviet consulate. The building was suspected, correctly, of being a hub of support for the communist rebels. As soldiers surrounded the compound, consular staff frantically burned secret documents. The smoke rising from chimneys as they destroyed evidence of Soviet involvement in the uprising. Consul General Boris Pokhvalinsky, knowing resistance was futile, ordered the gates opened. What followed was a rampage. The consulate was looted, its offices torn apart, and its staff, both Soviet and Chinese, were arrested and dragged through the streets in a public display of humiliation. The next day, 5 Soviet consular employees and 7 Chinese staff members were executed. Pokhvalinsky himself was expelled from China. Chiang Kai-shek, emboldened by the suppression of the Canton uprising, ordered all Soviet consulates in China closed. Diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Kuomintang China collapsed, and they would remain severed for nearly a decade. The Canton consulate massacre was a stark lesson in the limits of Soviet power and the dangers of backing revolutionary movements in unstable countries. It was also a preview of the violent intersection between diplomacy and ideology that would define much of the Soviet experience abroad. Fast forward to the final years of Joseph Stalin's life, and the Soviet Union had become a superpower, its influence stretching from Eastern Europe to East Asia. But Stalin's paranoia had also reached its zenith. In January 1953, Soviet state media announced the discovery of the so-called doctors' plot, a fabricated conspiracy in which prominent Jewish doctors were accused of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders. The announcement triggered a wave of anti-Semitic hysteria across the USSR, with Jews targeted in purges and propaganda campaigns. The atmosphere was toxic, and it spilled over into Soviet foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East. The Soviet Union had been one of the first countries to recognize the State of Israel in 1948, a decision driven by the hope that the new nation might align itself with the socialist bloc. But by 1953, Stalin's attitude toward Israel had soured, influenced by his growing anti-Semitism and his suspicion that Israel was drifting into the Western orbit. On the night of February 9, 1953, an explosive device detonated inside the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv. The blast injured 3 people: the wife of the Soviet ambassador, the wife of the embassy janitor, and the embassy driver. The explosion was not massive, but it was enough to cause panic inside the compound. What happened next revealed the dysfunction and paranoia that gripped Soviet diplomatic missions. Embassy staff did not immediately call for an ambulance. Instead, they spent precious time coordinating with Moscow, seeking instructions on how to respond. When medical help finally arrived, the injured were treated, but the damage to Soviet-Israeli relations was already done. Israel condemned the attack immediately, launching an investigation and expressing regret. But the Soviet government was in no mood for diplomacy. On February 12th, just 3 days after the bombing, the USSR severed diplomatic ties with Israel and withdrew all its diplomats from the country. The decision was abrupt and punitive, and it left Israel strategically isolated, losing its connection to the Soviet bloc at a time when Cold War alliances were hardening. It would be years before the full story of the bombing emerged. The attack had been carried out by a Zionist underground group called the Kingdom of Israel, a radical faction that opposed Soviet influence in the region and sought to provoke a break in relations. The perpetrators were arrested in 1953, but their identities and motives were only confirmed through later research. For Israel, the loss of Soviet recognition was a blow. For the Soviet Union, it was a self-inflicted wound, a decision driven more by Stalin's paranoia and ideological rigidity than by any rational assessment of Soviet interests in the Middle East. The embassy bombing and the subsequent diplomatic rupture highlighted how easily Soviet foreign policy could be hijacked by domestic political currents, and how vulnerable Soviet missions abroad were to both external attacks and internal paralysis. But if the Canton massacre and the Tel Aviv bombing were disasters born of external violence and internal paranoia, the case of Oleg Lyalin in 1971 was a catastrophe of pure incompetence. Lyalin was a KGB officer stationed in London, operating undercover as an employee of a Soviet trade mission. His job was to gather intelligence, maintain contact with Soviet agents in Britain, and prepare for potential sabotage operations in the event of war. He was, in other words, a key node in the Soviet intelligence network in one of the most important Western capitals. And he destroyed it all in a single drunken night. On that night in 1971, Lyalin got behind the wheel of a car after drinking heavily. He drove through the streets of London with his headlights off, a reckless and conspicuous act that quickly attracted the attention of police. When officers pulled him over, Lyalin lost his temper. In a moment of staggering stupidity, he blurted out that he worked for the KGB, as if that would somehow intimidate the British police into letting him go. It had the opposite effect. Lyalin was detained, and Soviet officials immediately scrambled to retrieve him, but it was too late. He vanished into British custody, and it soon became clear why. Lyalin had been working for British intelligence for years, secretly passing information to MI6. He had handed over the names of nearly every Soviet agent operating in the United Kingdom, exposing the entire network. The British government moved swiftly. More than 100 Soviet operatives and diplomats were expelled from Britain in one of the largest mass expulsions of the Cold War. The Soviet Union retaliated by expelling 18 British diplomats, but the damage was catastrophic. and one-sided. The Soviet intelligence network in Britain never fully recovered from Leolin's betrayal. According to Oleg Kalugin, a former KGB general who later defected, KGB chairman Yuri Andropov was furious. He personally ordered Leolin's assassination, but British intelligence had anticipated this. They hid Leolin, changed his identity, and provided him with round-the-clock protection. He lived under an assumed name for the rest of his life, dying in 1995, more than 2 decades after his drunken confession. The Leolin case was a humiliation for the KGB, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed intelligence operations could be undone by human weakness and poor judgment. It also revealed the limits of Soviet reach. Despite Andropov's orders, the KGB could not touch Leolin on British soil. The network he had helped dismantle remained crippled for years, a gaping hole in Soviet intelligence capabilities at a critical moment in the Cold War. If Leolin's downfall was rooted in drunkenness and impulsiveness, the case of Vladimir Vetrov was a tragedy of passion and violence that exposed another massive Soviet intelligence failure. Vetrov was a KGB lieutenant colonel, a career officer with access to some of the Soviet Union's most sensitive secrets. In the early 1980s, he was also a double agent, working for French intelligence under the codename Farewell. For years, Vetrov passed vast amounts of classified information to the French, including details of Soviet scientific and technical espionage operations. He exposed hundreds of Soviet agents working around the world, agents who were stealing Western technology to prop up the lagging Soviet economy. The information Vetrov provided was so valuable that it was shared with the United States, where it helped the CIA identify and neutralize Soviet operations across multiple continents. But Vetrov's double life came to an abrupt and violent end in 1982. During an argument with his mistress, a woman named Olga, who was also a KGB officer, Vetrov lost control. He murdered her. A passerby witnessed the killing, and Vetrov, in a panic, killed the witness as well. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. It should have ended there, a crime of passion that had nothing to do with espionage. But Vetrov made a fatal mistake. While in prison, he attempted to send a letter to his wife, asking her to keep French intelligence informed of his situation. The KGB intercepted the letter. The contents revealed that Vetrov had been a traitor for years, and the scale of his betrayal became clear. The KGB launched an investigation and discovered the full extent of the damage. Vetrov had handed over thousands of documents exposing Soviet agents, operations, and technological espionage efforts worldwide. In 1983, he was returned to Moscow, charged with treason, and executed. The Vetrov case was another devastating blow to Soviet intelligence, compounding the damage done by Leolin a decade earlier. It also highlighted the chaotic and sometimes self-destructive behavior of Soviet operatives, men who were supposed to be disciplined professionals, but who instead succumbed to jealousy, rage, and recklessness. The final scandal on this list is different in nature. A slow-burning mystery that unfolded over decades and left lingering questions about the lengths to which the Soviet Union was willing to go to gain an advantage over its adversaries. It began sometime in the 1950s when American officials discovered that the U.S. Embassy in Moscow was being bombarded with microwave radiation. The source of the radiation was a building across the street, almost certainly controlled by Soviet intelligence. The Americans detected the radiation, measured it, and studied it, but they made a fateful decision. They kept it secret from most of the embassy staff. For years, diplomats and their families lived and worked in the embassy, unaware that they were being exposed to microwave beams of unknown purpose and unknown intensity. The secret held until 1974, when Ambassador Walter Stoessel decided to inform the staff. The revelation caused panic. Diplomats demanded to know why they had been kept in the dark and what the health risks might be. The U.S. government downplayed the danger, insisting that the radiation levels were low and that there was no evidence of harm. But the fear was real, and it was not entirely unfounded. Stoessel himself developed severe health problems not long after his tenure in Moscow. He was diagnosed with leukemia and died in 1986. His family believed that the microwave radiation had caused his illness, though no definitive link was ever proven. The incident became known as the Moscow Signal, and it remains one of the most enigmatic episodes of the Cold War. The purpose of the radiation was never conclusively determined. The most widely accepted explanation is that the Soviets were using the microwave beams to power eavesdropping equipment inside the embassy, allowing them to intercept American communications without the need for physical bugs that might be discovered during security sweeps. This theory is plausible and fits with known Soviet espionage techniques. But there were darker suspicions as well. Some American officials believed that the radiation was intended to harm embassy staff, either as a form of psychological warfare or as an experiment in the effects of long-term low-level microwave exposure. These claims were never substantiated, and Soviet officials denied any intent to cause harm. The U.S. government, reluctant to disrupt ongoing arms control negotiations, chose not to make a major public issue of the Moscow Signal, though they did raise the matter privately with Soviet counterparts. The Moscow Signal scandal dragged on for decades, with periodic flare-ups as new ambassadors arrived and old fears resurfaced. It was only in the late 1980s, as the Cold War began to thaw, that the radiation was finally turned off or ceased to be a concern. But the damage, both physical and psychological, had been done. American diplomats in Moscow had lived for years under a cloud of uncertainty, never quite sure whether they were being slowly poisoned by an invisible enemy. The incident underscored the pervasive atmosphere of mistrust and hostility that defined the Cold War, and the willingness of both superpowers to push the boundaries of acceptable behavior in their quest for intelligence and advantage. These 5 scandals, spanning from 1927 to the 1980s, reveal a pattern of failure, violence, and recklessness that haunted Soviet diplomacy throughout the 20th century. The Canton Consulate massacre showed the dangers of backing revolutionary movements in volatile regions and the brutal consequences when those movements failed. The Tel Aviv embassy bombing demonstrated how domestic paranoia could poison foreign policy and lead to self-inflicted diplomatic wounds. The Lyelin case exposed the fragility of Soviet intelligence networks and the catastrophic impact of a single compromised officer. The Vetrov affair revealed that even the most valuable agents could be undone by personal failings and poor judgment. And the Moscow Signal left a lingering question about the ethics and intentions of Cold War espionage, a question that remains unanswered to this day. Taken together, these incidents illustrate the profound challenges the Soviet Union faced in projecting power and maintaining influence abroad. For all its military might and ideological fervor, the USSR was often undone by the human weaknesses of its own personnel, the rigidity of its political system, and the hostility it provoked in other nations. These scandals were not isolated events. They were symptoms of deeper structural problems that would ultimately contribute to the Soviet Union's decline and collapse. The legacy of these failures can still be seen today, in the strained relationships between Russia and many of its neighbors, in the lingering mistrust between East and West, and in the cautionary tales they offer about the limits of secrecy, the costs of paranoia, and the dangers of sacrificing human judgment on the altar of ideology.